Okay, guys, I'd like to introduce Emer Shukru. Amongst other things, she's involved with smart taxes and is going to talk to us in particular about taxes today and how we could run the economy a little bit better if we just had smarter taxes, essentially. And we're going to talk about how there's tax reform inertia, essentially, under this system. You know, governments just aren't in a position to really look at tax reform in any sort of a serious way. All right, thanks, Emer.
Actually, I'm going to talk about how money and taxes are really the same thing. And it's more than inertia that we don't have tax reform, because to have tax reform would probably mean that we would have money reform. They're actually very much related. So, I first came across modern money theory about 5 years ago when the bust happened. And my understanding of money came very much from Richard Douthwaite. And the thing about that is that that understanding of money was prevalent in the NGO and environmental sector. It was known in the grassroots, but it didn't seem to have percolated at all in the professional economist level or in the so-called legitimate publications. Which was very depressing, because when you brought up these ideas that Paul described, you were kind of regarded as some kind of raving lunatic. And that you basically didn't have any kind of fundamental understanding of finance and money. And yet I discovered that in America and in Australia and in Britain, there were a group of accredited professors of economics in universities producing PhD students who had broadly the same similar analysis about money, which I thought was wonderful. Surely to God now that we have proper professors with doctors in front of their names and many published papers, that these ideas will get some kind of currency, to use the term. Anyway, that didn't happen, because there's a lot of reasons why the current system, the current understanding of the system suits people. And in the end of the day, it is extraordinary that the kind of money system that we wanted to bring into existence is in existence. It's only a matter of a government realizing its powers and doing it. And this will not cause the end of the world. So modern money theory isn't a theory. It's actually a practical description of the way the money system works. I'm going to look at money not from the banking perspective in the beginning, but first from the government perspective. And MMT starts from that point. It says, what is a currency and why does it have value? And effectively, modern money, since the 1970s, since we went off the gold standard, is only backed by the fact that you have to pay taxes in that currency. That is it. It's not backed by anything real, essentially. It comes down to the fact that you have to pay your taxes in that currency. That makes governments very powerful. Then that currency, the money then is created using that currency by the banks. That is true. And most of the money in circulation has been created by the banks, but the currency is backed by your taxes. And governments have that basic control. So, as we've heard earlier, and I would definitely agree with Paul's analysis of the origin of money, it is created simply by debt, by keystrokes in a computer. And when the debt is repaid, that money disappears. And therefore, net borrowing is needed for economic growth. And that is a fundamental problem for environmentalists or anybody who's concerned about the future in this finite planet, because you cannot have an exponential system, financial system, that is regulating all activity on a planet that is basically finite. That is a serious problem. But the basic fact is, a sovereign government, and that's a government that issues its own currency, we're not sovereign, does not have to raise taxes before it spends or sell bonds. It can simply spend the money. Now, it requires the taxes in order to get things done for all our benefit. In a way, it's an incentive system. And it needs to tax as well in order to control the value of the money, the value of the currency, to stop inflation and to keep its value more or less steady relative to other currencies. So in a way, the money and taxes, paying your taxes to government, parallels paying your debts to banks. It disappears. This is in a country like the US, UK, Iceland, not Ireland. We use a foreign currency. We use the euro, and that is issued by a central bank, the ECB. It's not linked with any particular government, although some would say that it's dominated by the German government and the Bundesbank. So, in fact, the problem with Ireland and the whole Eurozone is that governments participating in the Eurozone, not using their own money, do have to raise taxes in order to spend. And that is the fundamental flaw at the heart of the Eurozone project. And the payment of taxes still underpins the value of the euro. And the bust we had in Ireland was fundamentally different from what happened in Greece. In Greece and in Italy, to a certain extent, they discovered that the currency held its value even though the people didn't pay their taxes. So you have a free rider problem. That wasn't the case for Ireland. We had other problems. So what are the implications of MMT, this theory, this new understanding, this new framework, or this new epiphany about the way money is created? Well, it means that a sovereign government can spend without borrowing if it wants to. But if it wants to preserve the currency, the value of the currency, which is important really for social solidarity, and the economy is important, yes, but really for our social well-being, it is important that it broadly holds its value. And it should broadly hold its value in relationship to other currencies. But that doesn't always hold. Sometimes it's better for that currency value to drop. Now is a good time, for instance. It must tax that back, though. It must take the money, and if it spent it without debt, it must, if it spends it anyway, it must bring the money back in to keep the money supply stable, or it must mop it up by selling bonds. So those like Warren Mosler, who was a very successful bond trader, was one of the sort of co-originators of MMT theory. He saw this as he was trading, and then he met others who, professors of economists, and they agreed that this is actually the way it actually happens. Anyway, to come back to taxes. For money to hold its value then, it's very important that taxes are widespread and unavoidable, because then the currency could lose value, or you get free rider problems like Greece and Italy. Nobody talks about this. And the interesting thing is transnational corporations don't pay any taxes, and they are actually devaluing their own financial assets. They're depending on taxpayers, the rest of us, the ordinary people, the 99%, to pay their taxes and maintain the value of the currency. And it is a confidence trick. It's not a literal payment of taxes. It's the fact that we believe that we must and will, generally speaking, pay our taxes. So you need this sort of public consensus about the value of it. So taxes must be broadly accepted by the people of the nation. It is a kind of social contract. Anyway, if you don't need taxes in a sovereign nation in order to spend, on what basis do you raise taxes? There is a big issue. You've got to remove money. So how do you remove money? Well, obviously, one thing is you can use your money. A government can use your money to spend to provide the service that we all need. We all agree about that. Where the money is broadly spent: education, health, defence, infrastructure, and so on. Rule of law, all of those things that we collectively need. But how do you take it from people? Now, the first thing socialists would say is redistribution. Take more from the wealthy, take less from the poor, and that's fair. But could there be a better way of doing it? This is the problem with redistribution. Have you ever given a toy to a 3-year-old? let them play with it for a while, and then try and take it back. Because this is the reaction you get, guys. We have allowed 1%, less than 0.1% to get egregiously rich and powerful, but rich mainly, a huge amount of wealth, to the point where they can't even spend it. But they think it's theirs, and they don't have the same sort of social buy-in, and they don't feel they should pay it. They are like 3-year-olds, essentially. Certainly, limited companies are not even 3-year-olds. They're more like single-cell creatures. They have very simple rules, and they do not easily give back their toys. So that is a major problem with redistribution. And of course, practically, you find that the very rich never pay tax. It's the middle classes that pay tax, not the rich. I mean, if you had a rich man paying more than 20% tax, he would fire his accountant. And even people like Bono, who kind of fly the world on a high moral mission, doesn't see why he should pay tax in Ireland, which is incredible. So there's this big problem. So anyway, I would suggest there's a better way of raising taxes, and that is to incentivize people, essentially set up a system to protect real wealth. It's to link our virtual wealth, this money, this currency that we've created, with real wealth. And real wealth is our natural and social commons. These are the things that are real. Money is not real. At any point we could, if we wanted to, reinvigorate this economy. The depression is not our problem, is a real problem. The problem is impending climate change and oil peak. That is the problem. And we have a lot of resources. Unfortunately, we have a system that doesn't allow us to engage our resources to deal with these threats. So natural wealth, the land, the oceans, the atmosphere, clean water, minerals, fossil fuels, biodiversity, the electromagnetic spectrum, all of those things, that is the natural commons. I think people could generally accept that and understand that. What is harder to understand is we also have a social commons. And that's everything that human culture has created over the generations from the beginning of time as we evolved. All of that cannot be said to be owned by one individual currently, already. Yeah, I'll have to speed up. That's a social commons. And included in that is money. Money was invented collectively. And I would say that money is a social commons. I would also say that site values, the value that attaches to land, has been created collectively and shouldn't be. It isn't in the ownership of the happy site owner. It belongs to all of us. So the natural commons is a big difference. The natural commons can be damaged by overuse and exploitation, but the social commons are damaged by enclosure. That means the private sector taking off bits to itself and not allowing other people to use it. So when they patent knowledge, for instance, and they stop the course of scientific exploration and technological advancement, that is a loss to us. If we lose a language, that's a loss to us. So I'm saying we can tax for sustainability. And the money system can be used. It's a wonderful invention in many ways. Flawed, yes, but it has evolved without any thought. So we have to democratize the money system, which means to give it intent and purpose. And we can do that and help us to overcome our huge problems, which I've listed here, by simply charging for the use of the commons. And that is the base. That should be the basis, the greater part of our tax system. That doesn't mean that you get rid of income taxes entirely and other transaction taxes or whatever, taxes that are good for us, like taxes on alcohol. But a large part of the tax, the basis of our tax, should be charging for the use of the commons. And this mechanism would preserve the value of virtual money at the same time as preserving the value of real wealth, so that you wouldn't get this disconnect. So when we are actually, our money has gone up in value, it's because our real wealth has gone up in value. It is mirroring a real reality. So it would realign finance capital, which has got out of hand. It's gone feral. It's gone disengaged from the real world. And it is dragging us into an abyss. It will realign finance capital with the other two important, or three would say, forms of capital. It would reduce inequity and poverty. And this is the most important point. The reason why the 1% are rich is because they've been robbing the commons. And the biggest ones are land and property and finance. So land it's a sort of a mixture of a natural and social commons. Site value is a social commons, and money, which is a social commons, and they have enclosed it. They have made it their own, and they have become egregiously rich and powerful. So who owns the commons? Well, nobody owns the commons, or we all do. All you can say really is that we are the beneficiaries of these commons. But you should never be able to sell a common, so in that sense it can never be owned. And the kind of beneficiaries for a commons varies according to the commons. You can have a big commons like the atmosphere and the oceans, which can only be, the beneficiaries are all of us now and in the future. But for instance, a local fisheries, it is expedient, it makes sense that a community that is a good steward of that commons should be the main beneficiary. But you can have different levels of access or beneficiaries to various commons. So another thing about a commons is it's an inheritance that you get just by being born, just by being a human. So you don't have to earn it. It's not something that you have to argue you deserve, A, because you're brilliant and have contributed, or B, because you're poor and you need it. So it gets rid of those arguments. It's an inheritance. Simply by being alive, you have a right to that commons. So you have the basic arguments then to reallocate some of the income stream for those commons directly as a basic income. And a basic income is a very good way of getting new money into the economy. And I think Paul will be discussing something a little bit similar, which is basically a debt-free distribution of money. So I want to talk now about site value and how this relates indirectly and directly to what I've been talking about. I want to talk about what happened in Ireland, not what happened in the US, because we had a plain, simple, vanilla flavor property bust. No fancy derivatives and slicing and dicing and so on and so forth. It was absolutely the same kind of property bust that they have basically every 18 to 20 years in developed economies. We missed the last one because we were too depressed. It was hardly noticed. But once we got wealthy, we could hit the heights and we could have our very own property bust. So I will just talk generally about it. In the 1990s, there was genuine productivity increases in Ireland, increased population. We had debt-free grant aid from the Eurozone, which is often forgotten, and we had the transnational corporations coming here. And we had genuine productivity increases, which increased wealth. Land ownership is broadly owned in Ireland, not the same as in Britain, where the Normans still own most of the land. But in Ireland, we had the Land Acts and we had a land struggle, so there's widespread ownership of land. So that money actually got distributed quite broadly. And in the beginning, it was all good. I mean, what was there not to like? Everybody was getting a little bit of it. Unfortunately, it got too attractive. What happened was that investment was diverted from production, which was generally for export or for making goods and services, which created money and made people wealthy. It got diverted into property because the profits were there. It was easier to borrow, of course, and the tax incentives were there. And what happened then was that the value of the site rose from about 10-15% of the total property price, house price, to around 30-40%. That was still manageable for a while because we could still show that the rental income, and in the end of the day, it's the rental income that is the guide to the capital value of a property, and it tends to hover, go right back to about 14, 15 times the rental income is usually in mid-times the value of a property. It's called the years purchased in valuation terms. And that should be the basis of which money is lent, but because what you can rent the property for, the rent, the open market rent, bears some kind of relationship to the value of its use value, not the income of the owner, unfortunately. And if we thought about our houses in a way as a benefit we're getting instead of a kind of a peculiar cultural need to own something, that would have been more apparent to us. Anyway, we'd entered Ponzi territory in the year 2000 and beyond. That meant the only return the developer could see, really, in the end of the day, or the buyer could see, would be if the year's purchase went up, if the capital value went up because the rents were more or less staying stable. The only way it could make any sense would be if the capital values went up and so on. That's called Ponzi finance, essentially. And the portion of the land value to the finished property value went up to 60% and over. In urban areas was and over. And the banks lent against these future land values, essentially. Remember, it was less than 10 developers, and there was mostly raw sites, undeveloped sites, that brought down the Irish property system. It was mostly land speculation and development. The current crisis we're in with mortgagees not being able to pay is only happening now. It was the developers that done it, and the banks. So it's not all our fault for the actual crash. The number of people who pricked this bubble were quite small. And I don't think we should carry the guilt for the whole shebang. Now, the problem about lending against sites is even worse than lending against existing building. But the problem about lending against sites, and most of that lending in the last 3 years was against sites, was that nothing new was pulled into reality through the lending. There was no construction on that element. The land already existed. So you were creating basically unrepayable debt. It wasn't because there wasn't enough zoned land. I'll go quickly through this. You'll hear this in Britain. In Britain, they think that property values have gone up and gone too high because there isn't enough zoned land, and they're busy rezoning trying to rezone a lot of their countryside. But of course, that's difficult because, as I say, the aristocrats still own much of the land in Britain, and they only do it when it suits them. But it wasn't a shortage of zoned land. You didn't even need zoned land in Ireland. A large part of the housing, up to 40% of the time, was built on unzoned land, one-off houses in the countryside, no developers involved. And some of the best sites are still undeveloped now. So how can that be if it's only a shortage of zoned land and the planning system? Bank regulation is not enough. I will say that is not enough to regulate the banks. If the banks had been regulated in Ireland, we would have had European banks coming in. We did have European banks coming in, and they were the ones that actually spurred the ridiculous 100% lending criteria. The other thing to worry about regulating banks, for instance, the usual way is you have to have 30% of the capital, or we'll only give you so many times the rental income, or whatever, is that that leaves it all to people who already have capital and older people. And it's very difficult for young people to acquire property. And I think that's fundamentally unfair. I think the property values would still rise under regulation because it would be like the banks. You'd have a lot of rich people, but they'd be bidding against each other. And you would end up, again, as we had in the 1800s, 1700s, where most of the property and houses were owned by a small group of people. Now, that is the danger. So I would say that a lack of tax was a major cause of the crisis. I won't say it was the only cause, but it was a major cause of the crisis in this country, and we're not talking about the US. And site value is, as I say, is a social commons. It's created by social capital and public investment. The landowner does nothing, essentially. But it can be captured by the landowner because of the natural monopoly nature of land. And this has been known for centuries. And the early progressive economists, talked about this a lot. The physiocrats and others. This is well known. Stamp duty and capital gains tax are not the same thing as an annual tax on the value of land or the imputed rent of the land. It doesn't work the same way. You can avoid it by not transacting. And you can get around it. And of course, they dropped capital gains tax and so on. So there were so many exceptions that it wasn't really any kind of a break on the price rises. And of course, we had the incentives even as the market obviously overheated. So most wealth, when you look at it, and there's very little studies on this where wealth is, but they did a study in Britain, I think it was Michael Hudson, and it worked it back that 75% of all wealth is actually real estate. And a large part of that is the land value, because the actual building itself is a depreciating asset. The fact of the matter is, because there was no taxing back of that value for the community owned that value, they were the beneficiaries, the banks could. First, the developers and the landowners got it, but then in the final days, the banks got in the act and they got it. That's what happens. That's what happens when you don't charge for a commons. Anyway, impacts on housing form. You know all this stuff. Housing was built on unsuitable sites. The construction quality was poor. I'm an architect. We didn't have the standards. Even the standards we had weren't adhered to. That's because the actual construction of the building was seen as a cost. The profit was made the minute they got their planning permission. And it was a matter of realizing that in something that passed for a building. That's essentially it. So there was no incentive there was no competition on design and construction. I mean, one sign of this is that we developed nothing, even though we built our housing again. You know what I mean? We built 50% of our housing during the boom period. There was nothing learnt in that time that was worth exporting to other countries. We made no technological advancement because there was no competition on construction technology. There was no development, for instance, of community-based servicing systems, which they had in other countries for energy and waste, because it was simply an estate was built and the house was sold off. The owner had little interest in the running costs of those houses. And we still have prime sites in the city wastefully, and it is a cost on the economy. It's a cost on us for prime sites, good located, well-serviced, important sites to be undeveloped. This is a cost on us, and that's the result of not having a site value tax. And there's many social and economic impacts. The main thing was that bright people put their time and their energy and their money into becoming developers. And it wasn't hard on a rising market, but these guys think they're geniuses and still think they're geniuses and have to be paid at least $100,000 a year by NAMA so that NAMA can consult with them. I mean, I'm a valuation surveyor. I've done development. I'm telling you, it is not rocket science. The main work was done by the professionals anyway. These were chancers. We have a name for them in Ireland, chancers. And we had a policy that promoted chancers, essentially, in this country. It was a huge loss to us. It drew in a lot of people who should have been doing other things. Housing became unaffordable, and that's why they had to invent a new category called affordable housing. I mean, it's incredible that this didn't raise issues. I mean, that caused further social fragmentation and so on. A big thing, I mean, I am so much against what happened in rural countrysides and the loss to us that you're going to feel for many years, and this still hasn't come home to us yet, what has been lost there. But we have caused social stratification in rural areas because the towns and villages now have all the working class people and the immigrants. The middle class have taken to the hills pretty solidly, and they're insisting on keeping their rural schools so that they don't be contaminated by working class people and dark-skinned people. That's essentially it. Intergenerational inequity has grown. I just don't understand why the young people are not out marching and what is being done to them. I have 3 kids, 2 have emigrated. I mean, it is the greatest rip-off of all time. And the trade union people are still preserving the rights of professionals who had protected contracts, public servants, and the upper levels that have incredible levels of remuneration. Of course, the financial sector still persists, and the government itself. They're all old. Look around, they're all grey-haired. All the grey-haired people have paid off their mortgages. They're not the people who are underwater. This is intergenerational warfare, and the people who are suffering don't seem to realize it. So I think it takes grandmothers like us, to speak for young people until they can find their voice. And we have a problem too that a lot of people foolishly invested in buy-to-lets instead of in proper pension funds, or actually the best pension fund is your kids at home earning tax, which pays for your pension. So a lot of people are going to be facing poverty in their old age. Shortcomings of the current residential property tax. The developers aren't paying anything. It's unbelievable. They own about 30% of the zoned land, the land under houses or zoned for housing, or sites, and they're paying nothing. Why is that? If we had a site value tax, they'd pay. But no, we have a property tax, and only those who are living in a house pays. And that means there's no money available to help people who bought in the boom. And we all know why that is, because the banks don't have that property now. Now, they brought in an 80% development land tax. This is never going to happen, guys. We've already overzoned 3-5 times. And this new tax will apply to tax zone from now on. So it'll never be levied. It was just a sop to trade union movement and socialists. The RPT penalises improvements. When we need to improve our houses to prepare for fossil fuel peak, we are going to have to pay more tax when we do it. And we were actually developing expertise in this area. In fact, the passive house, which I think is the best way of measuring the success of construction in reducing energy use. Ireland is sort of developing as the first English-speaking exponent of it. We've done a lot now, and we're exporting that knowledge to America. So the interesting thing is, in the bust, in the last 5 years, when we're building practically nothing, we were actually developing a technology that was worth exporting. But this is going to end that. And it discourages construction when workers are idle. Now, you might think we've built too much. We've built too much in the wrong place and the wrong stuff. We need construction workers. So there is a lot of work still to be done. So first steps in tax reform. Again, coming back to money and tax, the same thing. Debt that cannot be repaid will not be repaid. Michael Hudson says that. This debt is not going to be repaid. The question is, when does that realization happen? And I want that realization to happen before our government has sold off our real assets, our commons assets. They're not quite there. They've stepped back from selling Quilta, but it won't take much more. The next shock, and the demand will be up to sell Quilta, Bordemona, possibly our water assets, and certainly our wind assets. That's already on the table to pay off these irresponsible debts. So, but the crash will happen anyway. The question is, are we going to still have our natural capital at that point? So I say the zoned land and site owners should have to pay an annual tax immediately, and then shift to a site value tax eventually. Development levies, which are mitigate against clustered sustainable village development, should be changed so that somebody who's building on an unzoned site has to pay the servicing cost up front for that. That means very heavy development levies. The other thing I would say that the government could do right now, and we've made this recommendation to Hogan and it's just been ignored, shift commercial rates from the occupier to the owner. Do it as site value tax or do it as the straightforward rates, I don't care. But the main thing is that this is the effect of a downward lease, essentially, because you're paying rent and you're paying your rates, right? And you're paying your services. And the fiction is that the rates are paying for the services. But really, what you need to do is to pay the capital, a portion of the capital value of that site, or as some describe it as the location benefit levy. The services are actually paid for separately. But if we shifted rates from the occupier to the owner will not be able to up the rent until the next review, and then only to market level. So it's essentially a permanent relief situation for the occupiers. That could be done very quickly.
We're sort of into your question time already.
Oh, yeah.
So are we near the end?
I think I am. So the next steps. After that, I mean, this is what Paul is going to do. We have to reclaim the banking system and the money system from the financial sector. We have to move to a land tax on agricultural land because we're looking at a cap system which is providing a sinecure for landowners. And we have to immediately get most of the economic value out of wind turbines because this is the biggest rip-off that's happening in this country and we have to wake up to it. We have to bring in other commons like cap and share, cap and dividend to charge for the use of the atmosphere as a dumping ground. And there is a bill in America, cap and dividend, very similar to cap and share. So it's not a mad idea. I know this will take time, but the climate change is happening faster than I thought. I thought we'd have full fossil fuel peaking before climate change is going to hit. It doesn't look like that. So we really have to move quite quickly on it. And events maybe will help us. And we have to reclaim the cultural commons from restrictive copyright laws. Like Bono, for instance, insisting on copyright for his music, although his music was developed because of the work of others. So tax is not about raising money. This is the amazing thing. It's not about raising money. If you were sovereign, we wouldn't have to do it. Of course, we're not sovereign, so we have to raise money. But there is a way out. Now, this isn't a permanent solution. This isn't the answer. The answer is money reform. But we can do this because there's no law against it, and the Germans are very rule-oriented. There is no law against our government issuing bonds that are backed by the fact that their face value can be used to pay taxes. And what is money? Money is backed, it's a currency which is backed only by the fact that it's acceptable for taxes, the only currency that is acceptable for taxes. So if Ireland says the face value of these bonds is accepted for taxes, it becomes like money. We become a little bit sovereign. Now, it is debt-based. But if you believe, as many do, that the way to get out of this recession, and we do need to get out of it and to get moving again, is to spend more, and particularly spend more on the infrastructure that is needed, and even give money away on some kind of widespread basis. Could be a job guarantee, it could be the citizen's income, and that in turn will bring in the taxes, which will reduce our overall public debt. And I do believe that, and you need a government that believes that. Then you can do this safely. It's not too late. So I always say to people, it's not too late, and it's not your fault. The fault is with less than 1%, 0.1 of 1% really. The system broadly works amazingly. The money system is an amazing creation. We just have to upgrade the system. It's not that hard. There is a small group of people in whose interests this system is run. There are not many. There were not many developers. There were not many bankers. There are not many people who are at the top of this. I love looking at land history. And when the land struggle began, I noted that Michael Davitt and the others made a list of how many people opposed land reform. And they got it down to 50,000 only in Ireland. And that made it possible. But if you say to people, the fault is in you, the whole system has to be changed, the capitalist system is defunct, you're just going to meet overwhelming fear and a loss of confidence. In fact, mostly the system works amazingly well, but we could make it work much better. We could completely realign it in democratic aims. And the changes that have to be made are remarkably small, given that there are virtual changes in our money and our tax system, that has the effect of aligning our desires and our needs and the desperate need to face up to the challenges facing us with our economic system. That is all that really has to be done, and that is achievable. Thanks.